Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our free LSAT prep hour. My name is Allison Bell, and I am an instructor for Manhattan Prep. I have been teaching the LSAT for almost 10 years now, and I currently live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I teach classes here in person, as well as online classes, and I'm also a tutor. I'm excited to have you all here to do a little bit of LSAT prep with me tonight. The first thing that I'd like to do before we start is just learn a little bit about who's here tonight. So I'm going to ask you to share a couple of things with me in the chat window, and I'll tell you how to do that in just a second. I would love, if you're willing to share, to hear your name, where are you located, and where are you at with your LSAT prep right now? So for example, are you in the middle of a course? Are you just getting started? Is this your first experience with LSAT prep? Are you winding down your LSAT prep and getting ready for an exam? So please take a moment to share in the chat window. You should see, if you look for a little orange glow, you'll see that lighting up as other people start to chat. Let me know if you need help finding it. Awesome. Welcome, Alexander. Hi, Caitlin. Awesome. Welcome. Ilana? I'm going to go with Ileana. If you feel like typing me a phonetic pronunciation, please do. Hi, Alexis. Awesome. We got a couple of different people in Florida. That's great. Okay, Caitlin, awesome. This should give you a good sense of what we're all about at Manhattan Prep. Cool, welcome, Chelsea. I actually lived in DC for the better part of the last decade, and I just moved out to California in June. Hi, Michelle. That is perfect. I was just asking everybody to share where they are and where they're at in LSAT prep. Cool, so it looks like we have people at all different stages of prep. We've got some folks who are right in the middle of it, some folks who are about to start, and some folks who are winding down. So that's excellent, and I will keep that in mind as we go through our session tonight. Okay, awesome, welcome, Maria. Let me just clear this board off. All right. So for those of you who are just getting started with your prep, I just wanted to mention that we do have some other free resources that are available for you if you're interested. One thing that you can do is try one of our classes online, or I'm sorry, one of our classes, period. I saw that a couple people are just about to start a prep or are using this to help them decide if they'd like to join a Manhattan Prep course. You can actually attend any of our session ones of the real full course for free. And we have those both in person in most major metropolitan areas, as well as online. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can check out our website and you can find a schedule of when those classes are held, and just sign up as a trial student for session one for free. And that's a great way to be informed about whether you'd like to take that specific course. We also have some really great free resources that are just available online, including a tool called LSAT Interact, which is kind of the closest thing that you can get to a live course without actually being in a live course. It's an adaptive video that delivers the same content that's in our curriculum, in our books, in our course, but it allows you to do that content at your own time, at your own pace, and anytime throughout the day, 24/7. You can use the LSAT Interact, and it's a really amazing tool. So I encourage you to check those out and look for other free resources on our website. Here's the game plan for tonight. We've got about an hour to spend together, and we're going to be using that time to focus on a particular topic within the logical reasoning section of the exam. For those of you who are just getting started with your LSAT prep, you may have already learned that there are 3 major tested components of the LSAT. There's reading comprehension, logic games, and logical reasoning. And today we're going to hone in on logical reasoning in particular. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a second if you've never done a logical reasoning question before. The 2 types of questions that we're going to talk about tonight both have to do with the structure of an argument. We call them identify the conclusion questions and determine the function questions. Just so I can get a sense, tell me in the chat window, just give me a yes or a no if you know what logical reasoning is and you've done a question of logical reasoning before. Give me a yes. If this is totally new for you, give me a no. Great, good, okay. Cool, it looks like we've got a lot of yeses, and William, I like your all caps no. Don't worry, you are about to find out what logical reasoning is. Okay. So just to put this in the bigger context of logical reasoning questions as a whole, one of the things that we do in our course and in our strategy guides is break down all of the logical reasoning questions into a variety of question types to help you develop a strategy for each type so that you can approach it successfully. Those types are listed here, and the percentages next to them reflect how frequently those questions tend to show up on the LSAT as a whole. We've got a big group that we call the assumption family, which are all arguments where you have to kind of analyze the argument and figure out what is it assuming and address that in some way. And then we have a group called other that includes kind of a smorgasbord of different types of questions, ranging from things that ask you to analyze argument structure to things that ask you to make an inference. Tonight, as we work on argument structure, what I want you to keep in mind is that the concepts that we're learning are fundamental to a very, very large subset of logical reasoning. Tonight, we're going to talk a lot about things like how do you find the premise and conclusion of an argument. And that is something that you need to do for the specific question types that we'll be doing tonight, which are going to be these analyze the argument questions. But it's also a fundamental skill for all questions in what we call the assumption family and all matching questions. So knowing how to break down an argument is going to really boost your success overall in logical reasoning. So I kind of gave this away here, but what is an argument on the LSAT? An argument on the LSAT is something that has a premise and a conclusion. So we will have a little bit of support or evidence to justify some type of conclusion. For example, if I say those brownies look delicious, therefore you should buy them. Then I have a premise, those brownies look delicious, and a conclusion, you should buy them. Airtight argument, am I right? Always buy the brownies. Arguments can have a couple of other components besides premises and conclusions. Does anybody know any other components of an argument? If so, type it in the chat. Nice, okay. So we've got a couple other big components of an argument showing up here. You can have a premise, you can have conclusion, you can also have background information, which is information that just provides you with a little bit of context about the argument, but doesn't actually play a role in supporting the argument or making a claim. It's just kind of like nice to know. For example, if I added to my argument, this is a package of brownies made by Duncan Lee, or what is that even, Duncan Hines, then you would know where these brownies came from, but it doesn't really play any particular role in my argument. So that's background information. I also see intermediate conclusion being mentioned, and that's going to come up when we start getting into our questions tonight. The intermediate conclusion is when you have sort of 3 steps in your logical chain. So you have a premise, which supports some sort of smaller conclusion, which is then used to support a final conclusion. So be on the lookout for that type of structure as we go through questions. I saw mention of necessary and sufficient assumptions. That's a great topic to bring up. That is actually like a full question type. So not every argument will have a necessary or sufficient assumption, but you may sometimes be asked to find a necessary or sufficient assumption as your task. So that makes a lot of sense. That's definitely a challenging area, Alexis, and being comfortable with what we're working on tonight will help with that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with some questions. If you don't already have it, you may wish to grab some paper and a pencil now so that you can take notes as you're working through these questions. The first type of question that we're going to look at is called identify the conclusion questions. This falls within the broader subcategory of analyze the argument on that roadmap that I showed you just a minute ago. There tend to be about 3 of these on any individual LSAT test, and you will know them when you see the language expressed here. So what expresses the conclusion or what expresses the main point of the argument. If you haven't already, one really great habit to build into your studying is to build your familiarity with how each question type is worded. When you see this language, what you want to have happen in your head is you immediately say, okay, this is an ID the conclusion, or even if you don't call it that, you know that your job is to find the conclusion and match it to the answer choice that fits it the best. So I'm going to give you a question in just a moment, and we're going to use that question as a tool for learning. So the first thing that I will do is I'll give you about 1 minute and 20 seconds to work on this question. If you're new to logical reasoning, that is the average amount of time that you want to spend on an individual question. It's flexible. Some questions are going to go faster than that, and some questions you're going to need a little bit longer than that. But the LSAT is a very time-pressured test, and so it's helpful to start practicing under time pressure so that you get a good feel for that. So I'm going to give you that realistic experience in just a second. I will put the question up on the screen, and I will just be timing you on my own, and I may pop off the camera for a second so that you can have some quiet think time without me watching you. When it is time, I will put up a poll and have everyone tell me what answer they got on this question. All right. Here it is. All right, time is up. I just launched a poll, so you'll see a little box pop up on your screen, and I'm going to ask you to go ahead and select your best answer. I would love for everyone to respond, so even if you're not sure and you feel like you'd like to take more time, just go ahead and take your best guess on this one. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to share a little bit of the thinking behind your answers in just a moment. Before I do, I just want to talk about the process that you want to go through on a question like this. So when you are doing logical reasoning, you always want to read the question first. Students often ask me that, and they come to me saying they've heard multiple opinions on this. 100%, you should definitely read the question first. That gives you a sense of what you should be thinking about as you read this paragraph, which makes you more efficient and faster. When you read this particular question, you notice that it's asking you for the main conclusion. So what you want to be thinking about as you're reading this paragraph is, how can I identify the actual sentence or sentences that state the conclusion? And you can be thinking about a couple of things here. You can be thinking about language indicators for the conclusion. So sometimes the LSAT will give you words like therefore or thus that will help you find a conclusion. You can be thinking about meaning. So you can think about, for example, what is the ultimate point that's being made? What is this argument being built to support? And then you can also think about organization, which we'll talk about in just a minute in more detail. There are certain structures that the LSAT likes to use for arguments over and over again, and you can learn to keep your eyes open for this. Yeah, Ileana, that's exactly where I was going to go with that. Looking for the buts. So one of the organizational patterns that can come up very frequently hinges around words like but, or however, or yet. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second and how it can be useful to you. So the first thing that I want to check on then is, I'm going to ask everybody to tell me which part of the argument did you identify as the conclusion? Did you identify the first sentence, the second sentence, or the third sentence? And you could also tell me that you identified more than one or part of one as the conclusion. Go ahead and type in the chat window which one you picked or ones. Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of twos as well as some ones and some threes. I'm going to go ahead and confirm that sentence 2 is indeed the conclusion. And ask you to tell me in the chat, what do you think is the function of sentence 1 and sentence 3 if they are not the conclusion? Great, yeah. See a lot of good observations. It looks like most people are in agreement that sentence 3 is providing support. And I would agree with that. One way I think about this is that every LSAT argument is going to have a conclusion, and then you're going to need to be able to answer the question, but why is that conclusion true? And the answer is going to be the premise. So if I say the conclusion is not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole, then I'm like, but why? And the third sentence answers that question. Well, it often ends up decreasing the number of employees, which harms the dismissed employees and the retained employees in different ways. So that helps to explain why. Sentence one, I see some people identified it as a premise. People are noticing that it is very general. It changes direction for sure. One of the pieces of an argument that can come up in addition to background information is what we call an opposing point, which is where an argument starts off seeming to go in one direction, so offering a certain point of view or perspective, but then the author ultimately comes in and says, but that's not actually a good thing, or that's actually wrong. And that's what we've got going on here. They start off and they're like, well, everybody wants to increase their productivity, and here's why. But then they jump in with a caveat. That is not actually always a good thing. That's part of the reason that the word but, or however, or yet that someone brought up earlier is a really powerful word in LSAT arguments, because typically when you see a sentence and it's followed by the word but indicates, and here comes what the author really thinks about that. Here comes the author's true opinion. So you'll see that in a form that looks like this very frequently. You'll start with some sort of opposing point, and then the argument will switch directions, and you'll get either the conclusion followed by the premise, or sometimes you'll get the premise followed by the conclusion. But this whole sort of bottom half of the argument will be the territory of the author's actual main point. So going back to our question, now we know that sentence 2 is the conclusion, and sentence 3 is there for support. When you identify that a sentence is background or opposing information, you can kind of mentally block that sentence out. Sometimes you may need to refer back to it in order to remind yourself of the context or a little bit of additional information. But otherwise, it's not typically going to be essential to breaking down the argument. And paying too much attention to it can distract you from the correct answer, especially when you start getting into assumption family questions. All right, so we've identified sentence 2 as our conclusion. Now we need to go through the answer choices and match it correctly. The two answer choices that I saw most people selecting here were answer choice A and answer choice B. I'm going to ask everyone to take a moment to read both of them and think not just about why you think your answer is correct, but also what is the problem that you see with the other answer. And when you're ready to enter that debate between A and B, go ahead and tell me in the chat window a little bit about your thoughts. Okay, Alexis, I'm going to respond to your comment about it doesn't say anything about it cannot be good. Do you mean the text or do you mean answer choice A? Okay, so Ileana is saying the conclusion is not a conditional. Productivity needs to be mentioned. We've got language strength being considered there. Good. These are all really important thoughts. When I look at answer choice A, one of the things that I noticed is that it is very strongly worded. It is using what we call conditional language, which is when we say that if one thing happens, that absolutely guarantees that another thing happens. That type of language is appropriate on the LSAT sometimes, but I always want to check, is that the kind of thing that they were saying in the argument? Were they saying there's an absolute guaranteed relationship between taking efforts to increase productivity and how the business as a whole will do? When I look back up here, I don't really see that type of strongly worded language. Instead, I see not all efforts. So that sounds like maybe there are some that are beneficial and a lot that are not. It's hard to break that down into a pure, if this happens, then that happens relationship. The other thing that is happening here is that answer choice A has a much broader scope than our text. So Michelle pointed out that the excerpt specifically says productivity, and answer choice A is broadening this to just general actions to taken to secure the survival of a business. There are question types on the LSAT where it might be appropriate for you to broaden the language in that way, but this isn't one of them, and that's why it's so important to know what your task is on the LSAT. For this particular question, I'm looking for something that very, very closely matches both the language and spirit of the conclusion. And so my conclusion was pretty specific to efforts to increase productivity, broadening that to all actions taken to secure the survival of a business is a little bit too strong. So for those two reasons, we're going to eliminate answer choice A. I liked what Alexis said about how in answer choice B, we've got the word some. And that is a much stronger match to the language that is used in the actual conclusion of not all. So if I have weak language in my conclusion, then I want to match that with weak language in my correct answer choice. We also have the correct scope with answer choice B, where they're discussing specifically measures that have to do with productivity and matching the idea of the conclusion. So answer choice B is the correct answer. And we'll move on to another question in just a moment. Before we do, I'm just going to point out a couple of things about the last three answers. And while I do that, if you have a question or comment, feel free to throw it in the chat window. Answer choice C is an example of an answer choice that goes too far and starts trying to make an inference based on the text. Answer choice D is an example of something that does match what was said in the argument, but it's the wrong part of the argument. It matches the first sentence, which we identified as the opposing point. And answer choice E does the same thing. It matches up with the premise. The reason I point this out is because even though no one chose these answers, if you get familiar with the characteristics of wrong answers on the LSAT, and you start to know what patterns there are for each question, it will make you much faster at eliminating those answers. So you can quickly see D and say, oh yeah, I read that, but that was part of the opposing point, and cross it off. Or see an answer choice like C and say, well, no, I'm not allowed to take an argument so far. And so you would cross it off. All right, any questions so far? Okay. I'm gonna pause the screen share for just a minute so I can give you another question. Okay, here's your next question. I will give you about 1 minute and 20 seconds to work on it. All right, that is time, and you have a new poll popping up. All right, thank you everybody for your participation. This is interesting. You are much more divided on this question than you were on the last one, which is generally an indication that a question is a bit harder. That's something that we also could predict in this case. The last question that I showed you was, I believe, question number 1. So the very first question on that particular LSAT. And one cool thing to know about logical reasoning is that there's a somewhat predictable difficulty curve. So questions 1 through 5 tend to be the easiest questions on a particular test within logical reasoning. Between about questions 8 and 12, there tends to be a little bit of a spike in difficulty. And that spike in difficulty is meant to slow you down a little bit and throw off your pacing. Because this is question 10, we can anticipate that perhaps there are some traps in this question, and we should be careful and not necessarily go with our first instincts, but make sure that we're using good, solid process. So for this question, let's do the same thing that we did on the last one. I'm going to mark 3 parts of this argument. We're going to go, the first part is just that first full sentence. Part 2, I'm going to put up to the comma before the word and, so we're going to split it right there. And then part 3, right here, and tell me in the chat window which part you identified as the conclusion. William, I got a little pop-up that you raised your hand. If you have a comment or question, you can either type it in the chat or you might be able to turn your microphone on and just talk. Oh, okay, great. Cool. It looks like we are mostly thinking that number 1 is the conclusion. And I would agree with that. We've got a strongly worded opinion statement that something should be used. Should is a great indicator. Okay, there's an opinion. A conclusion has to be some sort of potentially debatable opinion. I find myself reading that sentence and asking, why? And just like in the last argument, that question why is then answered by our support. So we are then given our premises. Clearly, they help prevent misinterpretations, and scientists should be diligent in trying to avoid misinterpretations. Ilyana, I saw your question mark about, is that last one an intermediate or a premise? It does kind of walk that line. I would identify this as 2 premises. But more importantly, I would say for this particular question, that distinction is not especially important. Instead, if you can identify that sentence 2 and 3 as support for the conclusion, then you don't really need to worry too much about the distinction. And in fact, the distinction between a premise and an intermediate conclusion is something that the LSAT almost never tests. Instead, they're more likely to want you to know the difference between an intermediate conclusion and a final conclusion. So you don't have to get too hung up on that. All right, so we have our conclusion here. These double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible in scientific experiments. And then the question becomes, which of our answer choices is the best match for this conclusion? We had a lot of different answers in. The 2 most popular answers were answer choice B and answer choice E. And we also had some folks who were thinking about answer choice C and D. So I'm going to start with the two most popular answers that you all picked, answer choice B and E. And I'm going to ask you to look at those two and see if you can identify some differences between them and what you might think might be correct about one or incorrect about the other. And when you have an idea for B and E, tell me in the chat window, what is your thinking? Not just the answer, but what you're thinking behind it. Okay, I see some really thoughtful and important comments in the chat window. And I see some people changing their minds. So there are two big things that I see people thinking about. Number one is, does the language match? So for example, I see people saying, well, I see scientists in answer choice B, but it doesn't say scientists in the actual sentence. I see proportion in answer choice B. It doesn't actually say proportion in the sentence. And the second question is, do the ideas match? So people are thinking about that as well. When you're doing this type of question, it is always more important to make sure that the ideas match than that the actual words used are exactly the same. So if I'm evaluating between answer choice B and answer choice E, I'm going to be breaking each answer choice into components and seeing if it has a match back to the sentence in terms of a reasonable language substitution. So it might not use the exact same words, but does it seem like they kind of generally meant the same thing? So let me show you how that would work with answer choice B to start with. So it says, it is advisable. Okay, I see that that kind of matches up with should. That's a similar, different language, but same general idea. For scientists to use, okay, I see they're talking about scientific experiments. So they don't say the word scientist, but presumably if it is a scientific experiment, it's being conducted by a scientist. So I think that's probably like a reasonable logical leap for me to make. To use double-blind techniques, okay, that's pretty clearly stated in the conclusion, in as high a proportion of their experiments as they can. I don't remember seeing the word proportion, but I do see whenever possible. And I'm thinking, are those two things basically the same? Like if I do this whenever possible, am I going to be doing it in as high a proportion as I can? I'm thinking, yeah, that's a pretty similar concept. So for me, answer choice B comes away pretty clean. It doesn't use the exact language, but all of the ideas check out. They've all got some basis in the text that I identified as the conclusion. So I'm okay with the fact that they didn't use exactly the same language. Let me see the same for answer choice E. So double-blind experimental techniques. Okay, I see that that is mentioned, so I think that that checks out. Are often, that checks out as well. The degree of language is whenever possible, so often sounds okay. An effective way of ensuring scientific objectivity. Okay. This part, when I look for it in the conclusion, I'm like, which part could be ensuring scientific objectivity? The truth is, I just don't see it. The conclusion is just a strong statement that says, scientists should do this. They should use double-blind techniques. We don't start hearing about scientific objectivity until we get into the premise territory. And even when we get there, the language doesn't necessarily say it will ensure scientific objectivity, just that it will help to prevent some misinterpretations that come from not being objective. So answer choice E, I have some questions about, and I think that what it is doing is a common trap for this type of question, which is that it's presenting something that is trying to be a summary of the whole paragraph. But as a result, it's bringing in parts of the paragraph that are not actually the conclusion or the point that it's trying to make. And it's also got a little bit of inaccuracy going on. This doesn't really end up saying that, the argument doesn't end up saying that this is an effective way to ensure scientific objectivity, even if you read it all and you synthesize it. So answer choice E would not be correct and is not correct on the LSAT for those two reasons. It's inaccurate and it brings in information that is primarily from the premise and not from the conclusion. I'm going to pause for a second and let you tell me what questions you have. Okay. Yes, absolutely. That's where I'm going next, Aria. So why the other ones are wrong. And then I will come back to your question right after that, Ileana. Okay, so if we look at answer choice A, scientists' objectivity may be impeded by interpreting experimental evidence on the basis of expectations and opinions they already hold. So if I go back to the text, I do remember reading that. Here are expectations and opinions that scientists already hold, but that is in the premise territory. So this is something that seems reasonably accurate, but comes from the wrong part of the argument. It is not the conclusion. If I look at answer choice C, scientists sometimes neglect to adequately consider the risk of misinterpreting evidence on the basis of prior expectations and opinions. So I see here that this is referring back to the premise. The language is matching the wrong part of the argument. It's also reaching a little bit. It is sort of making an inference on the basis of it. It doesn't actually tell us that scientists neglect to consider the risk, although we might infer that by understanding that scientists do sometimes have these misinterpretations because of their expectations and opinions. But we don't want to read too far into this argument for this type of question. That's not what we're being asked to do. In answer choice D, scientists should refrain from interpreting evidence on the basis of previously formed expectations. That seems to be the closest match to this final portion of the argument, which we also identified as a premise. So this is also the wrong part of the argument. Once you get comfortable with what this question type is asking for, as soon as you start to see that one of these answer choices is primarily focused on the wrong part of the argument, you can get rid of that answer choice. So this one, the correct answer is B. Alexis, I love that language of a premise booster. Premise boosters actually aren't really a thing for this question type. A premise booster is when you have an assumption family question and you get an answer choice that just says, hey, the premise is even more true than you thought that it was. You could certainly use that language to describe this if you wanted to, but really D is just restating a premise. It's not even like strengthening that premise, it's just like pretending that that premise is the conclusion, which is obviously not the case here. Ileana, are these traps seen more often in an LR that follows an RC? Like when you get the logical reasoning section as section 3 and read and compose section 2? Okay, gotcha. I would say no. These are just the traps, and they're going to be there no matter what order you get your logical reasoning in. Good question. Okay, awesome. If anybody's got other questions, let me know, or if you want to follow up on one of your questions. I'm going to pause my share for a second. I'm going to show you one new type of question. So the next type of question that we're going to look at is called determine the function. This is a variation from identify the conclusion. So it's still asking you about the argument structure, but it's no longer asking you just what is the conclusion. Instead, you're going to see a question where they give you a quote from the argument and they ask you what role that quote plays. So your job is to determine, is that quote the conclusion? Is it the premise? Is it an opposing point? Is it an intermediate conclusion? What's it doing? The number one trap here is that they give you this bold portion. And so then people are looking for the bold portion of the argument while they read. It's like this shiny object that they can't take their eyes off of. The problem with that is that if you read the bold portion and that's what you focus on, you're just going to know what it says, but you're not going to know what job it does. In order to know what job it does, what you really need to do is say, okay, so I see they're asking me this type of question. In order to solve this type of question, I need to find the conclusion. And then once I have found the conclusion, I need to relate the bold portion or the quoted portion. I should say quoted, it's not usually in bold. So I want to relate the quoted portion back to the conclusion. So I identified sentence 3 as the conclusion. The quotes are support for that conclusion, or the quotes are opposing that conclusion. What are they doing? So I'm going to give you a question to try this out on, and I encourage you to try that technique. All right, new poll is up. Okay, thank you, everybody. All right, so if you used the process that I just described, then you should right now have in your head what the conclusion of this argument is. So one last time, I'm going to ask everybody to identify sentence 1, 2, or 3. What do you think the conclusion of this argument is? Tell me in the chat window. Interesting. We've got kind of a split going on here between 2 and 3. I see 1 coming in as well. Okay. Well, let's break this down. Sentence 1 is definitely expressing someone's opinion, right? It's saying that it's a common complaint that the electronic media have corroded these literary skills, to summarize. I notice, however, that this opinion is followed by the word but. And you may recall from an earlier part of this lesson that the word but is a pivot word, and it usually indicates that we're about to shift from somebody else's opinion to the author's opinion. So even though sentence 1 does express an opinion, because it's followed by the word but, it tells me that I am about to hear the author's real opinion in a later sentence. So I'm going to rule out sentence 1 as something that is an opinion, but not the opinion that we're looking for. Perhaps it's going to end up being an opposing point. So then the word but helps direct me to the second and third sentences. And I see some people picking sentence 2 and some people picking sentence 3. One technique you can use to decide if you are torn between 2 sentences and which one is the conclusion is what we call the therefore test. And what I mean by that is you take the 2 sentences and you say, is it sentence 2, therefore sentence 3, or sentence 3, therefore sentence 2? And you're going to end up with whatever the premise is supporting the conclusion. So I might look at sentence 2 and say, okay, a long time ago, people said that literacy was going to destroy the skills that we had learned in an oral culture. Therefore, what awaits us is probably just an alteration, not a devolution. Or I can flip it and say, okay, what awaits us is probably an alteration, not a devolution. Therefore, several centuries ago, people said that literacy was going to destroy memory and other skills from oral culture. That second way doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense to start by saying, here's this thing that's probably going to happen in the future. Therefore, here's this thing that happened several centuries ago. It makes more sense to use the past to predict the future. So that would help me identify that sentence 2 is more of a premise, and it is supporting our final conclusion of sentence 3. 1, you wouldn't use the negation process here. There are a couple of circumstances where you could use negation. The most common one is on necessary assumption questions, where you use the negation test to determine which answer choice truly has to be true in order for a conclusion to work. You can also look for flaw answers that have an incorrect negation, but you don't need it here. Great. Okay, so let's take a look at our answer choices. I saw some people selected answer A, and then answer C, I think, was our other popular answer. So let's take a look at this. We've identified the conclusion. We've been asked, what is this reference to several centuries ago? Memory and extemporaneous eloquence were going to be destroyed, which is what we've got sentence 2. So we identified sentence 3 as the conclusion, which means that sentence 2, since it's in the territory of the author's argument, is being used to support that conclusion. It's giving an example of when people thought that something was going to kind of destroy certain skills or destroy the mind, but then everything turned out okay. So sentence 2 is being used to support sentence 3. So we know that it's some kind of evidence. Answer choice A says evidence supporting the claim that the intellectual skills fostered by the literary media are being destroyed by the electronic media. Ooh, this is interesting. And this is a common trap for this type of question, where it will correctly identify the role. So yes, this is evidence, but it will misidentify the conclusion later in the answer choice. So the conclusion that this evidence was supporting isn't the first sentence, it's the last sentence. So this evidence here is not being used to support statement 1, it's being used to support statement 3. And because of that, I can eliminate answer choice A. Answer choice C ends up being our correct answer. This was an example of a cultural change that did not necessarily have a detrimental effect on the human mind overall, which is what it's being used to show when the final conclusion tells us that it's probably just a change in the human mind, not a devolution. So this is another way of describing it as support for that final conclusion, which makes it the correct answer. All right, that is about all we have time for tonight. I wanted to share just one last thing. If you are interested in checking out one of our courses, remember you can try session 1 for free, and you can find our schedule on our website there.